The summer sun of 1941 had barely risen when the roar of thousands of engines began to echo across the borders of the Soviet Union. It was the beginning of the gigantic invasion known as Operation Barbarossa, the grandiose plan of Adolf Hitler to destroy Soviet power and conquer the vast lands of the East. Along a gigantic front, stretching for thousands of kilometers, millions of Wehrmacht soldiers advanced like a storm of steel. Tanks crushed fences and farmland. Trucks kicked up clouds of dust. On the dirt roads, endless columns of soldiers marched, their helmets gleaming under the hot summer sun. For many of those men, it seemed like the start of a swift and glorious campaign. German officers firmly believed that the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks. Propaganda claimed that the Soviet army was disorganized, poorly trained, and incapable of resisting the German war machine. Many soldiers believed they would be back home before winter even arrived. And at first, it seemed like they were right. She was caught completely by surprise. Soviet planes were destroyed on the ground. Entire divisions were surrounded. Within days, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were marching into captivity, escorted by German guards. Across the fields and roads of Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia, the landscape began to change rapidly. Villages burned after the troops passed. Destroyed houses smoldered on the horizon. Civilians fled along the roads carrying what little they could. Salvage. Meanwhile, German armored columns advanced ever deeper into Soviet territory. Tanks cut through the fields like steel blades. Cannons fired on enemy positions that barely had time to react. The German soldiers felt they were participating in something gigantic, a campaign that would change the course of history. But amidst that absolute confidence, few realized what was really happening. With each kilometer gained, the German army moved further away from its supply bases. The roads worsened. The distances became gigantic. The destroyed cities offered neither food nor shelter, and far beyond the horizon, hidden in the depths of the Russian vastness, something was slowly beginning to take shape. It wasn't just an army, it was the territory itself, and winter. Most of those soldiers didn't know it yet, but they were marching directly into one of the most brutal scenarios in the history of warfare, a hell of ice, hunger, and death that would soon transform that dream of conquest into a frozen nightmare. In the early days of the invasion, the German advance seemed unstoppable. Wehrmacht columns surged eastward like an avalanche of steel and gunpowder. Narrow dirt roads trembled under the weight of thousands of trucks, tanks, and artillery pieces. The constant sound of engines, metal chains, and marching boots created a continuous roar that echoed across the fields of Eastern Europe. The German soldiers were confident. Many believed they were participating in the greatest military campaign in history, a blitzkrieg that would crush the enemy before they had time to react. Maps were opened inside command vehicles, and officers pointed to distant cities, convinced they would be captured in a few days. At the head of the columns, the tanks advanced rapidly, raising dust and destroying any resistance they encountered. Wooden houses were pushed out of the way. Fences and crops were crushed by the metal tracks. When resistance arose, the cannons fired without hesitation. Explosions shook the air, and columns of smoke slowly rose on the horizon. Wherever the army passed, the war left its mark. Attack planes dove over roads and villages. Bombs exploded between military depots and train stations. Rails were twisted by the impact of the explosions. Destroyed wagons burned slowly, spreading black smoke across the sky. Meanwhile, thousands of Soviet soldiers tried to resist, but many were completely unprepared for the violence of the initial attack. At various points along the front, entire units were surrounded. Without communication and without supplies, many ended up surrendering. Soon, long columns of Soviet prisoners began to appear, marching under German watch. Exhausted men walked with their heads down, covered in dust and sweat. Some were wounded, others could barely stand after days of combat. Even so, progress continued. Each day, German divisions advanced dozens of kilometers into Soviet territory. Important cities began to fall. Bridges were captured. Strategic roads passed into German control, but along with the progress came a problem that few had really considered. The distances in Russia were gigantic. Supply lines began to stretch dangerously. Trucks loaded with fuel, ammunition, and food had to travel hundreds of kilometers to reach the troops on the front lines. Many roads were nothing more than dirt tracks. When it rained, they turned into deep mud that swallowed wheels and bogged down vehicles. As the Germans advanced deeper and deeper into the Soviet Union, the territory seemed to become endless. Open fields stretched as far as the eye could see. Dense forests suddenly appeared in the troops' path. Small villages appeared and disappeared in the landscape like isolated dots in an ocean of land. And yet, the orders were clear. Keep advancing. The soldiers marched for hours under the summer sun, carrying rifles, ammunition, and heavy backpacks. Sweat dripped beneath their steel helmets. Dust kicked up. By the vehicles clung to their faces and clothes. At night, when they finally stopped to rest, many simply collapsed to the ground, exhausted. Some fell asleep immediately, still clutching their weapons. Others looked at maps or talked in hushed voices about how far this war would take them. Despite the fatigue, confidence remained strong. The initial victories reinforced the idea that the enemy was close to collapse. But far beyond the German lines, something different was happening. The Soviet Union was retreating, but it was not defeated. While some units were being destroyed or captured, others retreated further and further into the interior of the country. Entire factories began to be dismantled and transported eastward. New troops were being mobilized. Defensive lines were being prepared deeper into Soviet territory. For the Germans on the front lines, however, all they saw was progress. They kept moving forward, advancing ever deeper into the vastness of Russia, without realizing it, that swift race eastward was slowly taking millions of men away from safety, away from supplies, and ever closer to a silent enemy that had not yet entered the scene, the Russian winter. As the months progressed, the war landscape slowly began to change. The hot summer gave way to shorter days, and the wind that blew across the vast plains of Russia began to grow colder. At first, almost no one paid much attention to this. For many soldiers of Wehrmacht, it seemed like just another change of season. But time was running out. From the beginning of the invasion, in Operation Barbarossa, German planners had gambled on a quick victory. The idea was simple: destroy the Soviet army in a few months, capture the major cities, and force the collapse of the Soviet Union before winter arrived. Nobody really believed the war would continue into the coldest months of the year. Because of this, something crucial had been overlooked. Most German troops were not equipped to face a Russian winter. As autumn progressed, the first signs began to appear. The nights grew colder. The wind blew through the soldiers' thin uniforms. In the morning, a thin layer of ice began to cover the fields and roads. But the real problem was yet to come. Before the extreme cold arrived, came the mud. The first heavy rains turned Russia's dirt roads into a real nightmare. This period became known to the soldiers themselves as Rasputitsa. It was the mud season. Trucks were stuck up to their axles, heavy. Tanks struggled to move a few meters. Horses pulling artillery sank into the thick mud. Entire columns of vehicles would get stuck for hours, sometimes for days. The soldiers pushed trucks, pulled equipment with ropes, and dug with shovels in an attempt to free wheels stuck in the thick mud. Every kilometer of advance required brutal effort. Even so, the orders continued to advance. Meanwhile, the cold began to intensify. The mornings were now shrouded in a white, icy mist. Puddles of water froze overnight. Soldiers awoke to find their canteens partially frozen, their breath turning into clouds of vapor in the air. Some people began to notice something worrying. If that was just the beginning of the cold, what would happen when the real winter arrived? Many German officers tried to warn their superiors. Reports began to mention the lack of winter clothing, proper boots, and special lubricants for weapons and engines. But in the higher echelons of command, the belief that victory was near still existed. The idea of facing a full winter in Russia simply wasn't part of the plan. Meanwhile, on the other side of the war, the Soviet army was beginning to adapt to the new reality. Red Army, it was far from defeated. New units were being organized. Soldiers accustomed to extreme cold were being moved from colder regions of the country. They knew something that many Germans still didn't fully understand. The Russian winter was not just a season, it was a weapon. And very soon, when the first major snowstorms arrived, millions of German soldiers would realize they were trapped in a vast territory, ill-prepared, far from home, facing an invisible enemy that could kill as easily as any bullet. The cold was arriving, and with him would come one of the most brutal chapters of the war on the Eastern Front. Then, finally, winter arrived. At first, there were only small signs. Fine snowflakes began to fall silently across the open fields of Russia. The soldiers of Wehrmacht, they gazed at the grey sky as snow slowly settled upon helmets, rifles, and coats already worn by the campaign. Some even thought it was beautiful at first, but that beauty didn't last long. Within a few days, the snow began to fall more heavily. The icy wind swept across the open plains like an invisible blade. The temperature plummeted rapidly, far beyond what most of those men had ever experienced in their lives. Then came the real storms, the first major blizzards of the Russian. Winter surged over the German lines with terrifying force. The sky disappeared behind a white wall of snow and wind. Visibility dropped to just a few meters. It was almost impossible to see what lay ahead. The whole world seemed to have been swallowed by an ice storm. Roads disappeared under thick layers of snow. Trails used by trucks simply vanished. Entire columns began to lose their way. Drivers tried to follow the tracks left by previous vehicles, but often these tracks disappeared minutes later, covered by the storm. The confusion began to grow. Trucks stopped in the middle of the frozen roads. Some vehicles simply couldn't move forward anymore. Others got stuck in piles of accumulated snow. Soldiers got down to try to push, but their feet sank up to their knees. Meanwhile, the wind was blowing stronger and stronger. He could see through the German uniforms as if they were made of paper. Many soldiers were still wearing the same equipment from summer or autumn. Thin coats, inadequate gloves, and boots that offered no real protection against the brutal cold. Within a few hours, the cold began to show its true colors. The soldiers' hands were going numb. Their fingers were losing feeling. The simple act of holding a rifle or pulling the trigger was becoming difficult. Some men tried to warm their hands by blowing on them or rubbing them vigorously, but the freezing wind stole the heat almost instantly. At night, the situation got even worse. The temperature dropped even further, plunging well below zero. Soldiers tried to sleep in shallow trenches or inside abandoned huts. Many wrapped themselves in thin blankets or scraps of fabric in a desperate attempt to retain some warmth. Some lit small fires, but the wood was often wet or covered in ice. And even when they managed to start a fire, it was rarely enough to warm everyone. The cold penetrated everything. Boots would freeze overnight. Canteens would turn into blocks of ice. Weapon metals would get so cold they'd stick to skin if touched without gloves. And while the men struggled to survive the storm, the silence of the snow began to reveal something even more terrifying. The first dead bodies began to appear. Soldiers who had fallen asleep during the night and simply didn't wake up. Their bodies were found stiff in the morning, covered by a thin layer of snow that had fallen overnight. No injuries, no shots fired. They simply died from the cold. And that was just the first major storm. Around the German positions, the vast Russian landscape was now covered by endless kilometers of white snow. Forests, fields, and villages had disappeared beneath the ice. It was as if the world itself had turned into a frozen desert. And in the midst of this white inferno, millions of German soldiers were slowly beginning to realize a terrifying truth. They were not prepared for that war, and the Russian winter was only just beginning. As the cold intensified across the vast plains of Russia, a new enemy began to emerge for the soldiers of the Wehrmacht. A silent, invisible enemy that attacked not only the men, but also the machines on which they depended to survive and fight. In the early months of the Operation Barbarossa campaign, German tanks had advanced like relentless predators. Their tracks crushed roads and fields, their guns destroyed enemy positions, and their engines roared day and night as they advanced eastward. But now, in that brutal winter, something strange began to happen. One morning, a driver turned the ignition key of his truck. The engine coughed and trembled and died. He tried again. Nothing. Just the frozen silence of the Russian dawn. This started to repeat itself across the entire front line. Engines that once ran perfectly now simply refused to start. The oil inside the gears had turned into a thick, almost solid substance, unable to circulate through the mechanical systems. Batteries rapidly lost power in the extreme cold. Pipes froze. Trucks that were supposed to be transporting ammunition, food and fuel now remained motionless, covered by a layer of ice. Tanks faced the same problem. The crews would wake up before dawn and try to start the engines of their armored vehicles. Often, they would spend hours trying to warm up the machines. Some soldiers would place small fires under the engines, trying to melt the ice that formed on the metal components. It was a desperate and dangerous solution. One mistake, one uncontrolled flame, and the fuel could set the entire vehicle ablaze. But without warming up the engines, the tanks simply wouldn't move. In many cases, men would spend hours working on the ice, with metal tools freezing in their hands, trying to bring the machines back to life. Their fingers would go numb. Some even bled when their skin cracked from the cold. Meanwhile, the weapons were also starting to malfunction. Machine guns would jam when the mechanism froze. Rifles constantly needed to be disassembled to remove ice that accumulated inside the moving parts. Normal lubricant simply froze, making the weapons slow or completely unusable. Soldiers would sometimes fire, and the rifle wouldn't respond. Or worse, the firing was delayed, causing dangerous accidents. Even heavy artillery suffered from the cold. Cannons that once fired accurately now required lengthy preparations to function correctly. Some parts simply broke due to the contraction of the metal at extremely low temperatures. Mechanized warfare, which had given the Germans such an advantage in the first few months, was slowly beginning to disintegrate in the ice. Along the snow-covered roads, a scene that was becoming increasingly common could be seen. Abandoned vehicles, trucks left behind because their engines had frozen, tanks immobile, their tracks stuck in the ice, artillery pieces that could no longer be moved. Some soldiers tried to salvage what they could, others simply pressed on foot, leaving behind tons of military equipment that months before had seemed invincible. Modern warfare was being defeated by something far older and more powerful: the Russian winter. While the Germans struggled desperately to keep their machines running, on the other side of the front, the situation was different. The Red Army was much more accustomed to operating in that brutal climate. Their soldiers knew how to cope with the extreme cold, and their equipment was often prepared for those conditions. This was beginning to shift the balance of the war. What was once a fast and devastating war machine now advanced slowly, struggling against ice, snow, and temperatures that seemed capable of freezing even time itself. And for many German soldiers, a frightening realization was beginning to take shape. If the machines of war were dying in the cold, how long could the men resist? If the machines of war were beginning to fail under the brutal Russian cold, the human body suffered even more. For the Wehrmacht soldiers scattered across the frozen lines of the Eastern Front, each day became a silent struggle against an invisible enemy. The wind cut across the open plains with cruel force, piercing uniforms that had never been made to withstand such extreme temperatures. During the day, the cold was already brutal, but it was at night that the real terror began. As the sun disappeared behind the white horizon, the temperature plummeted even further. The air became so icy that breathing deeply, it caused chest pain. The vapor from the soldiers' breath froze quickly on their scarves and collars, forming small layers of ice on the fabric. Inside the makeshift trenches, the men tried to protect themselves as best they could. Some wrapped themselves in damp blankets, others huddled together to try and share warmth. There were those who stuffed their boots with bits of paper, cloth, or even straw, trying to create some protection against the ice rising from the frozen ground. But often none of that was enough. The first signs of freezing began slowly. First came the tingling in their fingers or toes. Then the sensation disappeared completely. The skin became pale, almost white. Many soldiers didn't realize the danger immediately. They only felt that their hands were numb. Hours later, the pain would arrive, a deep, burning pain, as if needles of ice were being driven into their flesh. Some men screamed as they tried to move their stiff fingers. Others simply remained silent, clenching their fists in an attempt to endure the suffering. In more severe cases, the fingers would begin to darken. The frozen meat slowly died. Military doctors began recording a growing number of cases of frostbite, extreme freezing of body tissues. Fingers, feet, ears, and even parts of the face were affected. In makeshift medical posts, doctors and nurses worked tirelessly. Some soldiers arrived carried by their comrades, unable to walk. Others were brought in on improvised sleds, trembling uncontrollably. The scenes were terrible. Men with completely frozen feet, toes as hard as stone. In many cases, the only solution was amputation. With simple instruments and little anesthesia, doctors had to cut off parts of the body to save the patients' lives. The cold also depleted men's energy. Hunger was beginning to intensify because keeping their bodies warm required much more energy. Many soldiers were already exhausted after months of campaigning. Now, their bodies were simultaneously battling cold, hunger, and extreme fatigue. Each day, more men simply couldn't go on. Some fainted during marches through deep snow. Others fell behind because their legs no longer responded. Companions tried to help, but often the only choice was to keep going. And there was something even more terrifying: the silent death. During the freezing early mornings, soldiers would fall asleep in their positions, perhaps leaning against a trench wall, perhaps wrapped in a thin blanket, perhaps just sitting in the snow, trying to rest for a few minutes. But the cold was unforgiving. As dawn approached, companions tried to wake them, only to discover they were no longer breathing. Their bodies were stiff. Their faces were frozen in a blank expression. No shots fired, no explosions. They simply died from the cold. And while this was happening on the German lines, something important was beginning to move on the other side of the war. The Red Army was reorganizing. Troops trained for winter. Combat, coming from the coldest regions of Soviet territory, began to arrive at the front. Soldiers accustomed to fighting in extreme temperatures, equipped with appropriate clothing, thick boots, and white camouflage that blended in with the snow. While the Germans struggled simply to survive the cold, a new danger was slowly approaching through the snowstorm. While Wehrmacht soldiers desperately fought against the brutal cold, something important was beginning to happen deep within Soviet territory. What at the start of the war seemed like a destroyed and disorganized army was slowly beginning to rebuild itself. In the first months of the invasion, the Red Army had suffered devastating losses. Cities had been taken, entire divisions had been surrounded, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers had been captured. To many observers, it seemed that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse, but the country was vast, and its capacity to resist was enormous. As German forces advanced ever deeper into Soviet territory, the government led by Joseph Stalin began a massive mobilization. Entire factories were dismantled in the west and transported thousands of kilometers to the east, far from the reach of the war. In remote locations, new production lines began to emerge, working day and night to manufacture weapons, ammunition, and vehicles. At the same time, millions of new soldiers were being recruited. Men from all regions of the Soviet Union were being called up to defend. In their land, many had little military experience, but they were determined to fight. They knew the enemy was advancing deep into their country, burning villages, destroying cities, and leaving a trail of destruction. But among these new reinforcements, there were also very different soldiers. Coming from the coldest regions of the Soviet Union, especially Siberia, units specifically trained to fight in extreme winter conditions began to arrive. These men were accustomed to the cold that was now devastating the Germans. They wore heavy winter clothing made of thick wool and fur. Their boots were wide and lined to protect against the ice. Many used white camouflage that made them almost invisible in the snow-covered landscapes. For them, that brutal climate was not an obstacle, it was a family atmosphere. Meanwhile, the German lines were becoming increasingly stretched and vulnerable. Many units were isolated, with limited supplies and exhausted men. Broken vehicles and frozen tanks were scattered along the snow-covered roads. That situation began to create opportunities. Small Soviet reconnaissance groups began to move silently through the frozen forests. Using skis or sleds, they traversed the snow-covered terrain with impressive speed. They were observing the German positions, they were counting vehicles, they identified weaknesses, and then they disappeared again into the white storm. Soon, the first attacks began. Soviet patrols emerged suddenly from the snow, firing on isolated German positions. Machine guns echoed in the silence of the frozen forests. Grenades exploded in ice-covered trenches. Often the Germans could barely react. Soviet soldiers appeared almost like white ghosts in the snow, attacking quickly and disappearing again before reinforcements arrived. These attacks were not yet major offensives. They were quick, constant blows that increased the tension in the German lines. Every night, the German soldiers heard strange sounds in the darkness. Footsteps on the snow, the distant crack of breaking branches, the echo of isolated gunshots in the midst of the storm. The war was changing. What had once been a powerful German offensive was slowly beginning to transform into a desperate struggle for survival. As winter deepened, the Red Army gained strength, confidence, and knowledge of the terrain. New units arrived at the front lines. Larger plans began to be prepared. And somewhere beyond the frozen forests and snow-covered plains, Soviet commanders were preparing something far greater, a counterattack, a massive blow that would explode through the winter storm and strike a German army already weakened by cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Soon, the snow would not only hide the silence of winter, she would be hiding an entire army advancing to war. In early December 1941, something shifted in the frozen silence of the Eastern Front. For weeks, Wehrmacht soldiers had endured brutal temperatures, endless blizzards, and a bone-chilling cold. Many believed the enemy was suffering similarly, unable to mount a major offensive in that white inferno. But they were wrong. In the early morning of December 5th, while the snow continued to fall across the Russian plains, the silence of the front was broken by a deep and frightening sound. Artillery. Hundreds of Red Army cannons began firing almost simultaneously, launching projectiles that tore through the frozen sky before exploding over German positions. The ground trembled under the impact of the explosions. Snow-covered trenches were shaken. Observation posts disappeared in clouds of ice and earth. It was the beginning of the great Soviet winter counteroffensive. Shortly after the initial bombardment, shadows began to appear in the storm. Soviet soldiers advanced through the deep snow, wearing white camouflage. Many moved swiftly on skis, traversing the frozen terrain with impressive speed. To the exhausted Germans, it seemed as if winter itself was attacking. Machine guns began firing. Grenades were exploding in the trenches. At various points along the front, completely unprepared, German units were hit by rapid and violent attacks. Many soldiers were still trying to warm up frozen weapons or prepare defensive positions when the first Soviet waves arrived. The fighting started immediately. In snow-covered villages, wooden houses were transformed into makeshift fortresses. Soldiers fought from door to door, from room to room. Broken windows became firing positions. Bodies fell in the snow, while gunshots echoed through the frozen streets. In the open fields, the fighting was equally brutal. Soldiers struggled through knee-deep snow. Each step required enormous effort. The icy air burned their lungs as men fired rifles and threw grenades amidst the storm. But there was something different about that moment in the war. For the first time since the start of the invasion, it was the Germans who were being pushed back. Soviet tanks began to emerge from the snow-covered forests. Engines roared as the armored vehicles slowly advanced across the frozen terrain. For many German units, already weakened and with few operational vehicles, organizing an effective defense was nearly impossible. In some positions, the soldiers tried to resist desperately. Machine guns fired until they froze again. Small groups fought until they ran out of ammunition. Officers shouted orders amidst the storm, trying to reorganize lines that were already disintegrating. But Soviet pressure continued to mount. The offensive came from several sides at once. Fresh troops continued to arrive on the battlefield, while the Germans had fewer and fewer men able to fight. Many were wounded, frozen, or simply exhausted after months of campaigning. The landscape of war began to change. Now it was the Germans who were retreating along the snow-covered roads. Columns of soldiers marched slowly through the storm, trying to escape the advancing Soviets. Abandoned trucks lay behind. Artillery pieces were left in the snow because there were no horses or fuel to move them. Some men carried wounded comrades on their shoulders. Others simply walked in silence, staring at the frozen ground as the wind blew snow into their faces. The dream of a quick victory in the east was beginning to crumble. The offensive that had begun with such confidence months before was now turning into a desperate fight for survival. And as winter continued to tighten its grip on the land, the German army began to realize a brutal truth. They weren't just fighting against the Red Army, they were fighting against Russia itself. The impact of the Soviet counterattack began to spread like a crack in thin ice. What had previously been relatively stable German positions slowly began to transform into a disorganized front, full of gaps and isolated units. In the preceding weeks, the Wehrmacht soldiers were already at their limit. Many had lost comrades to the cold. Others were sick, wounded, or exhausted. Now, with the massive advance of the Red Army, that weakened line of defense was beginning to break down. At various points along the front, entire units were caught off guard by Soviet attacks. During the early morning hours, as the wind blew snow over the trenches, groups of Soviet soldiers emerged from the frozen forests and fields. Wearing white clothing that blended into the terrain, they advanced rapidly and attacked German positions before the defenders could react. Chaos spread rapidly. Telephone lines connecting German positions were destroyed by bombing or simply froze and broke in the extreme cold. Officers tried to send messengers through the snow to deliver orders, but often these men never reached their destination. Without communication, many units began fighting virtually alone. In some villages, small groups of German soldiers resisted in destroyed houses or abandoned barns. Machine guns were positioned in broken windows. Sandbags and overturned furniture were used to form makeshift barricades. But the enemy kept advancing. Each day, more Soviet soldiers appeared on the front lines. New units, rested and equipped for winter, pressed against the already weakened German positions. The sound of artillery returned repeatedly, shaking the frozen ground and scattering shards of ice and wood. Soon, even more dangerous situations began to arise. Entire divisions began to run the risk of being surrounded. The Soviets were advancing along the flanks, bypassing German positions and attacking from the sides or the rear. Roads that had previously been used for supplies or retreat were now under enemy fire. In some places, the only option was to retreat immediately. Columns of soldiers began to move along the snow-covered roads. Men walked silently, carrying rifles, backpacks, and what little equipment they had left. Many constantly looked back, fearing to see Soviet forces emerging through the storm. The cold continued to claim victims. During these retreats, some soldiers simply couldn't continue. Exhausted, with frozen feet and bodies weakened by hunger, they collapsed in the snow and were left behind. Comrades tried to help them, but it was often impossible to carry a grown man for miles through the deep snow. The decision was cruel, but inevitable. Keep moving forward and leave your partner behind. As the Germans retreated, the landscape of war grew increasingly grim. Roads were littered with wrecked or abandoned vehicles. Frozen tanks lay motionless, covered in layers of ice and snow. Dead horses lay beside broken-down carts. Scattered ammunition crates froze on the ground. Artillery pieces that could no longer be moved were simply left behind. It was a portrait of an army that was slowly beginning to disintegrate under the weight of winter and enemy pressure. And yet, there was an order that would change everything. From the German High Command, led by Adolf Hitler, a decision had been made. German troops, they shouldn't back down, regardless of the cold, regardless of the losses, regardless of the Soviet advance. The order was clear: hold your positions at all costs. For thousands of soldiers scattered across the frozen plains of Russia, it meant only one thing: they were prisoners, trapped in the middle of a snowstorm, facing an increasingly powerful enemy, with no permission to escape. While winter continued to crush the German army on the frozen plains of Russia, a critical decision was being made thousands of kilometers away in the command centers of the Third Reich. For many generals on the battlefield, the situation was already clear. The troops were exhausted, ill-equipped for the cold, and under intense pressure from the Soviet counterattack. Strategic retreat seemed the only way to avoid an even greater disaster. But that was not Adolf Hitler's view. From his position at the German command post, Hitler believed that retreating would mean repeating the mistake that, according to him, had cost Germany its defeat in the First World War. In his mind, abandoning hard-won positions would be a sign of weakness and could transform a tactical retreat into a total collapse of the front. Thus, the order was transmitted to the units scattered throughout the Eastern Front: no retreat. The troops were to hold their positions, regardless of the circumstances. For the Wehrmacht soldiers facing the winter storm, that order felt like a cruel sentence. Many officers in the field knew exactly what that meant. Their units were scattered across destroyed villages, frozen forests, and makeshift lines of defense. The cold had already reduced the fighting capacity of many men. Ammunition and supplies were arriving with increasing difficulty. Nevertheless, the order was clear: hold position. Some generals tried to argue. They sent reports describing the reality on the front: soldiers freezing in the trenches, equipment failing, entire units isolated by snow and the Soviet advance. But the answers were always the same: resist, to fight, do not back down. In many areas, this forced German soldiers to transform small positions into makeshift fortresses. Wooden houses in Russian villages were reinforced with sandbags and barricades. Trenches were dug deep into the frozen ground with tools that could barely penetrate the rock-hard soil. The men knew the enemy was approaching, and they knew they couldn't just leave. Each day, the pressure increased. The Red Army continued advancing, launching new attacks against already weakened German positions. In many cases, the Soviets surrounded entire villages, isolating the German garrisons that were still trying to obey orders to hold their positions. Inside those surrounded positions, the situation was desperate. Food was rationed to the extreme. Soldiers shared small portions of frozen bread. Sometimes horse meat was the only source of food available. The cold was relentless, and the wind that blew through the destroyed houses seemed to pierce through any attempt at shelter. Even so, the fighting continued. Machine guns rang out through broken windows. Soldiers fired rifles as snow fell on their helmets. Grenades exploded in the narrow streets of frozen villages. Each house could be transformed into a small battlefield. Each snow-covered street could conceal approaching enemy soldiers. For many men of the Wehrmacht, the feeling was of being trapped in an endless nightmare. They could not advance. They could not retreat. They could only resist while winter and the enemy tightened their grip. And as this brutal fighting continued, the death toll grew each day. Some fell in combat. Others simply succumbed to the cold and extreme exhaustion. What had begun as a campaign of rapid conquest was now turning into a desperate fight for survival in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. And the worst was yet to come. Because in many parts of the front, the German positions were already on the verge of something even more terrible. The complete siege. As winter progressed and the fighting intensified, the situation for German troops scattered across the Eastern Front became increasingly chaotic. The vastness of Russia, combined with constant snowstorms, began to engulf entire Wehrmacht units. In many sectors of the front, the war map simply ceased to reflect reality. The lines that once seemed clear and organized began to disappear. Divisions that should have been connected to one another were now separated by miles of snow, forests, and Soviet patrols. What was once a continuous front had become a series of isolated pockets, each fighting on its own. The snowstorms made everything even worse. During the most intense blizzards, visibility dropped to just a few meters. The sky and the earth merged into a single white mass. Soldiers walking a few meters ahead could completely disappear from their comrades' sight. On certain occasions, entire patrols would get lost in the storm. Groups of soldiers went out to scout the terrain or try to find neighboring units, but the snow erased trails, hid roads, and confused any sense of direction. Some walked for hours believing they were heading west, only to realize they were walking in circles. The cold made every mistake fatal. Many of these men simply never returned. Some were found days later, frozen where they had fallen, partially covered by snow. Others disappeared completely, swallowed by the storms that swept across the Russian plains. Even large military formations began to face similar problems. German divisions that should have been operating with thousands of men were now reduced to small groups scattered across the terrain. Officers struggled desperately to rally their troops, but the lack of communication made this task nearly impossible. Radios often malfunctioned because of the extreme cold. Telephone lines were cut by bombings or simply broke when ice accumulated on the cables. Messengers sent through the snow risked never reaching their destination. Thus, many commanders simply did not know where their own troops were. Confusion reigned. German columns attempted to retreat along roads already under Red Army control. In some cases, soldiers marched directly into Soviet ambushes hidden in snow-covered forests. When the shooting started, the situation quickly descended into chaos. Soviet machine guns opened fire from unseen positions among the trees. Grenades exploded. Amidst the German columns, men threw themselves into the snow, trying to find shelter, while the sound of battle echoed through the storm. Many battles took place at extremely short distances. Sometimes enemies could only see each other when they were just a few meters apart, suddenly emerging from the icy fog of the blizzard. It was a brutal and chaotic war. Soldiers were fighting not only against the enemy, but against nature itself. For many men of the Wehrmacht, the feeling was of being completely lost in a hostile and endless world. Around them, there was only snow, wind, and the distant sound of gunfire that appeared and disappeared in the storm. Some tried to follow the trail of footprints in the snow, but the wind quickly erased any sign of a path. Others followed frozen roads that seemed to lead somewhere safe, until they realized they were walking directly towards new Soviet lines. It was as if winter itself was hunting those men. Little by little, entire divisions began to disappear from the battlefield, not just because of the fighting, but simply because they were lost in the vast white desert of Russia. And while this was happening, an increasingly cruel reality began to take hold. The German army was no longer simply retreating. He was being slowly crushed by the cold, the distance, and the enemy who was now advancing confidently through the snow. With the Red Army's steady advance and the collapse of several German positions, many Wehrmacht units were finally given permission to retreat. But what, on paper, seemed like an organized withdrawal quickly turned into one of the most brutal experiences those soldiers would ever face. The retreat was not a simple march backward. It was a daily struggle for survival. The roads were covered in deep layers of snow and ice. Many of them were already destroyed by bombing, blocked by broken-down vehicles, or simply disappeared under the constant storms that swept across the Russian plains. Columns of German soldiers began to move slowly through that frozen landscape. The men walked with difficulty, sinking up to their knees in the snow. Each step required enormous effort. Many carried heavy backpacks, frozen rifles, and the little equipment that remained from their units. The wind blew violently, kicking up snow that struck faces like small blades of ice. Visibility was often so poor that soldiers could only see the man at the front of the column. And then came the nights. As the sun disappeared, the cold became even more brutal. Temperatures plummeted to levels few of those men had ever experienced in their lives. Some tried to dig small holes in the snow to shelter from the wind. Others wrapped themselves in thin blankets or pieces of tarpaulin salvaged from abandoned vehicles. But the cold continued to penetrate everything. The boots were freezing. The uniforms stiffened with the ice. Their fingers tightened around the rifles. Many soldiers were already suffering from the severe effects of frostbite. Walking was becoming increasingly painful for those whose feet were injured or partially frozen. Even so, stopping meant risking never being able to get up again. During these marches, the German columns began to leave behind a silent trail of tragedy. Exhausted soldiers collapsed in the snow. Some tried to get up again, but their bodies simply wouldn't respond anymore. Companions looked back, often wanting to help, but they knew that stopping could mean death for everyone. In many cases, the only choice was to keep walking and leave the man behind. Soon the snow began to cover the fallen body. No shots fired, no battle, just another victim of the Russian winter. As these columns slowly advanced along the frozen roads, new dangers constantly arose. Red Army patrols frequently attacked these retreats. Using skis or sleds, Soviet soldiers moved quickly across the snow-covered terrain, emerging from nearby forests or hills to fire upon the German columns. Machine guns opened fire. Grenades exploded among the trucks and carts. Chaos reigned on the roads. Soldiers threw themselves into the snow trying to find shelter. Officers shouted orders in the middle of the storm. Wounded soldiers screamed as their comrades tried to drag them out of the line of fire. Often, the Germans were able to repel these attacks, but each confrontation left more men dead or wounded on the road, and the march continued. The surrounding landscape seemed increasingly apocalyptic. Roads were littered with abandoned vehicles, dead horses, and equipment scattered across the snow. Fuel tanks that had run out of fuel remained frozen in place. Some still had soldiers inside them, men who had tried to protect themselves from the cold inside the machines and never woke up again. For the survivors who continued marching, it felt like crossing a frozen cemetery. Each kilometer traveled seemed to demand more strength than the last, and yet they kept walking because everyone knew something terrible. To stop meant to die. While German soldiers desperately battled the cold, an even greater danger silently approached. For months, the Soviet High Command had been observing every enemy move. While the Germans believed victory was near during the Operation Barbarossa offensive, the Soviets were preparing something gigantic in the shadows. Now, at the height of winter, the time has come to attack. In the early hours of a freezing dawn, the silence of the Russian plains was broken by the deafening roar of Soviet artillery. Hundreds of cannons opened fire simultaneously. The dark sky lit up with explosions that shook the snow-covered ground. For the already exhausted Germans, it was a devastating shock. Immediately after the artillery barrage, columns of Soviet infantry began advancing through the deep snow. Men dressed in white winter uniforms, almost invisible against the frozen landscape, emerged like ghosts in the storm. Many were Siberian troops, soldiers accustomed to fighting in brutal temperatures, trained to survive in conditions that were destroying the German army. Meanwhile, Soviet tanks advanced slowly through the snow and smoke. Their engines roared like metallic monsters in the midst of the storm. For the Germans, the situation was desperate. Their tanks barely functioned in the extreme cold. The machine guns froze. Many soldiers were so weak from hunger and exhaustion that they could barely lift their rifles. And now, before them, a renewed enemy emerged, prepared and full of determination. Soviet attacks began to break through German lines at several points. Small, isolated positions were quickly surrounded. Entire platoons disappeared beneath waves of Soviet soldiers advancing through the snow. In some destroyed villages, violent battles raged house after house. Soldiers fought inside frozen huts, between broken walls and ice-covered bodies. Grenades exploded in dark rooms as men screamed in despair. The white snow soon began to be stained red. Many German soldiers realized something terrible at that moment. The Blitzkrieg that should have ended in months had turned into a deadly trap. The roads were blocked by snow and debris. Abandoned trucks formed long, frozen lines. Dead horses lay stiff beside broken-down carts. And now, with the Soviet advance, many German units were beginning to be completely surrounded. Out of fuel, no food, no suitable winter clothing. Some German officers tried to organize makeshift defensive lines. But the chaos was immense. Communications were failing. Units were scattered and disoriented. Meanwhile, the Soviets were pressing harder and harder. Reconnaissance patrols would suddenly appear in the snowstorm. Night attacks would strike German positions that could barely defend themselves. The cold, which was already a cruel enemy, now seemed to be working alongside the Soviet army. For thousands of German soldiers, this was no longer just a battle. It was a desperate struggle for survival, and the worst was yet to come. With the overwhelming advance of the Red Army, reality finally hit the German forces like a brutal blow. The campaign that had begun with absolute confidence during the Operation Barbarossa invasion was now turning into a desperate retreat through one of the harshest winters in history. The German lines began to break down in several places at the same time. Entire units were ordered to retreat immediately, but retreating in Russia, in the midst of a relentless blizzard, was something entirely different from simply marching backward. It was a fight against nature itself. Columns of soldiers began to move slowly along the snow-covered roads. The wind blew fiercely, raising clouds of ice that cut their faces like sharp blades. Many men walked almost blind, their eyes half closed, trying to see through the storm. The cold continued to descend, -40 degrees, sometimes even more so. Weapons were frozen. Vehicles wouldn't work. Tanks lay abandoned on the roads like useless iron carcasses. Trucks that once carried supplies were now buried under mounds of hardened snow. The retreat quickly turned into a procession of suffering. Soldiers marched with their feet completely frozen inside their boots. Many could no longer feel their toes. Some men, upon removing their boots at night, discovered that the skin of their feet had stuck to the frozen fabric. The smell of gangrene was beginning to spread among the wounded. Military medics worked tirelessly, but had almost no equipment. In many cases, the only solution was to amputate frozen fingers or toes using simple saws inside destroyed huts or abandoned barns. Without anesthesia, the screams echoed in the middle of the night. Meanwhile, the Soviet threat never disappeared. Red Army patrols would suddenly appear on snow-covered roads. Small ambushes were carried out against weakened German columns. Shots would erupt from the storm, then disappear. again into the frozen fog. Every kilometer traveled was paid for with blood. Dead horses piled up along the retreat routes. Lacking sufficient fuel, the German army relied heavily on these animals to haul artillery and supplies. But the horses were also dying from freezing or exhaustion. Without them, many artillery pieces had to be abandoned. For many soldiers, the world seemed to have turned into an endless white desert. Frozen forests, empty fields covered in snow, destroyed villages. Some units were completely lost in the storm. Small groups of men walked around without knowing exactly where they were going, trying only to follow any road that wasn't completely blocked by snow. Many simply fell in the snow and never got up again. His companions continued walking. There was no time to stop. The worst part was the feeling that it would never end. Day after day, week after week, German soldiers continued marching through the deadly Russian cold, exhausted, hungry, frozen. The campaign that should have been a quick victory had turned into an endless nightmare, a nightmare of ice, hunger, and death. And as the retreat continued, the truth began to become clear to many German officers. The dream of conquering the Soviet Union was crumbling, and thousands of soldiers were being swallowed up by the Russian winter. When winter finally began to lose its grip, months later, the Russian landscape resembled a gigantic frozen cemetery. For miles and miles, the snow concealed the traces of the tragedy that had occurred there. Roads were covered with abandoned vehicles. Rusty tanks lay motionless, half buried in the ice. Destroyed trucks were scattered like metal skeletons across the plains. Among them often were the bodies, German soldiers who never managed to escape the deadly cold. Some were still sitting against frozen trees, as if they had simply stopped to rest. Others lay beside frozen rifles in their hands. Many had died during the retreat marches, overcome by exhaustion, hunger, or the terrible cold of the Russian winter. What had begun months earlier as a campaign of rapid conquest had turned into one of the greatest military catastrophes ever faced by the German army. During the Operation Barbarossa offensive, millions of German soldiers had advanced deep into Soviet territory. At first, it seemed that nothing could stop them. Cities fell rapidly. Entire armies of the Red Army were surrounded and destroyed. But the war in Russia was unlike any other. The distances were immense. The supply lines stretched for thousands of kilometers, and when winter arrived, the German army simply wasn't prepared to face it. Inadequate uniforms, lack of fuel, vehicles unable to function in the extreme cold, scarce food, and an enemy who knew the terrain far better than anyone else. All these factors combined to make winter as deadly an enemy as any army. The famous German war machine, which had crushed entire countries in Europe, began to break down. Entire divisions lost thousands of men to the cold. Many soldiers suffered amputations due to frostbite. Others would forever bear the physical and psychological scars of that brutal campaign. But perhaps the most profound impact has been strategic. That winter shattered the illusion of a quick victory in the East. For the first time, the world began to realize that Nazi Germany was not invincible. The German advance had been halted. The army that seemed unstoppable was now fighting only to survive, and the conflict on the Eastern Front was only just beginning. In the years that followed, that frozen land would witness even more terrible battles that would completely change the course of the war. But for the soldiers who survived that winter of 1941 and 1942, the memory would never fade. They had witnessed something that few men in history had faced. A winter so brutal it felt like a weapon, a snowstorm as deadly as any battle. For thousands of German soldiers lost on the Russian plains, this was more than just a military campaign. It was a real blizzard of death, a death storm that engulfed an entire army in the frozen hell of Russia. As the last winds of winter began to subside across the vast plains of Russia, what remained was not just a battlefield. It was a scene that seemed to have been sculpted by death itself. For thousands of kilometers, silence dominated the frozen landscape. Forests covered in ice remained motionless, like silent witnesses to the tragedy that had unfolded there. Roads once filled with military columns were now littered with the carcasses of destroyed vehicles, abandoned tanks, and trucks frozen in the snow. Beneath that white cloak lay buried stories that would never be fully told. Soldiers who had marched with confidence months before were now part of that frozen land. Many of them had crossed the borders of the Soviet Union, believing they would return home before winter even arrived. The campaign initiated during the invasion known as Operation Barbarossa seemed at first an inevitable victory. But Russia had other plans. The vastness of that territory, the fierce resistance of the Red Army, and above all, the brutal winter transformed the campaign into something completely different from what the German strategists had imagined. The cold didn't just affect the soldiers' bodies. He broke the spirit of an entire army. Men who had fought in France, Poland, and so many other campaigns now faced an invisible, relentless, and constant enemy. The cold saw into their bones. The wind tore at their skin. The snow swallowed roads, cities, and entire battalions. And little by little, that war machine that had conquered much of Europe began to fail. The engines stopped. The weapons froze. Men were dying in their sleep in the snow. Many German soldiers came to understand something that generals on distant maps couldn't fully grasp. In Russia, the war wasn't just against the armed enemy, it was also against the land itself. Nature fought alongside the defenders. Each kilometer gained seemed to exact a higher price than the last. Each advance made the supply lines more fragile. Each night brought more deadly temperatures. And then came the moment when everything changed. The German advance has stalled. For the first time since the start of the war, the feeling of invincibility began to fade. That winter marked the beginning of a profound transformation in the war. The conflict on the Eastern Front would cease to be a rapid offensive and become a gigantic struggle of attrition, which would consume millions of lives in the following years. Even more terrible battles were yet to come, fields of destruction that the world would never forget. But it was there, in that brutal winter of 1941, that something fundamental happened. The myth of the quick German victory died in the snow. The Russian winter was not just a weather obstacle, he was a game changer in the history of warfare. For the soldiers who survived, the memory of that period would remain etched forever. Many would return home years later, carrying invisible scars. Memories of endless nights, of comrades frozen beside extinguished campfires, of desperate marches through seemingly endless storms. They had faced something that few armies in history have had to endure. A war within a war. A battle against the cold, against hunger, against fear, and against one's own destiny. Today, when we look back and observe that moment in history, it becomes clear that the Russian winter was not just a season of the year. It was a force that changed the course of World War II. On the frozen plains of Russia, thousands of German soldiers discovered in the most brutal way possible that some battles cannot be won with tanks, weapons, or strategy alone. Some battles are fought against something much bigger, against nature, against the clock, against the very limits of human survival. And that winter that became known as Blizzard of Death, Russia showed the world that even the most powerful army can get lost in the icy silence of a white hell.